City Club of Portland Friday Forum. City Club is where we bring civic-minded people together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Karen Curvin, president of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at Sentinel Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partner, Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Family Healthcare Plans, Legacy Health, Russell Fellow Properties, The Standard, and Stoll Reeves. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. A special welcome to civic scholars from Roosevelt High School who are in the audience with us today. Civic Scholars is our initiative to expand opportunities for high school students to more deeply engage in Portland's civic issues, bringing civic education out of the classroom and into the community. This morning, prior to the forum, they spent time with Sam Adams, former mayor and outgoing executive director of City Club. Students, please stand if you are able, and welcome to Friday Forum. Next week, we will have a conversation based on the newly released report, The High Cost of Low Wages. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. After our program, I will facilitate a question and answer session with our panelists. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your question. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards on the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. Hold your cards up high and City Club staff will collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now for our program. The economic recovery following the most recent recession in the U.S. has been long and tepid. Recent stronger growth indicates that the Oregon economy has finally emerged from the recession. Are we economically healed, or do we have some lingering ailments? Today's panelists, Dr. Tom Pitowski and Chuck Sheketoff, will answer those questions and many more. Dr. Tom Pitowski is a former state economist for the state of Oregon who served through multiple business cycles, and Chuck Sheketoff is the executive director of the Oregon Center for Public Policy. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Good afternoon. Is it working? Great, okay. Good afternoon. Always an honor to address the City Club. I think this is one of the major venues for all sorts of policy discussions and issues, and you really do the city quite a service. And so today, as Karen described to you, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Oregon economy and talk a little bit about sort of issues that may affect the Oregon economy, affect us here in Portland, in a little longer term sense than usually what I talk about, which is generally just short-term things. So what we're going to talk about today, given that title, well, you know, is the Oregon economy healed from emergency room to recovery room to leaving the hospital? You know, where have we been? Where are we? Where are we going? So we had one nasty recession. We had a housing crisis throughout the U.S. We had a housing crisis here in Oregon, in Portland, Medford, Bend especially. And what was just a housing crisis really unfolded into a financial crisis, right? When the housing bubble burst, it really unveiled a broken system of mortgages that were backed by securities and other shenanigans of the financial sector at the time. Oregon was particularly hard hit during this recession, harder than most other states. Places that were hit hard in Oregon were like Portland because of our manufacturing center here, and also areas that had the housing bubbles and in places that are tied to the wood products industry. So pretty much going through this, the state hit a bottom in about mid-2009. Portland was about the first area to come out of the recession, starting to climb out. Then that was joined by other metro areas in Oregon. And finally, we're starting to see the rural areas also starting to join the growth. A bit tepid, but still it's starting to happen throughout the entire state. So what does returning to health look like? How is the patient doing? Well, let me take a few areas. First, let's take a look at job levels. Employment peaked in the state around February of 2008, and it wasn't until just last November that we reached the same level of jobs, more than 6 years and 9 months later, just to get back to where we were. The unemployment rate was up to 11.6% in June of 2009. It fell almost 5 percentage points to 6.7% in December of 2014. We're still above the unemployment rate of 5% that we saw in early 2007, but we're definitely moving in the right direction. And in fact, the unemployment rate that was just released for Oregon was 6.7%. And so definitely, I think we will definitely get there probably in 2017. Now, we stalled out, though, in 2014 with an unemployment rate stuck around 7%, almost for the entire year. And that was a good sign. What I mean by that, how can that be a good sign, is that we were losing people from the labor force. It was people were dropping out of the labor force was helping to bring our unemployment rate down, even though we were having job growth. And now what was happening is that the job growth couldn't quite match the number of people coming back into the labor force. So that unemployment rate was sort of steady. And that's good signs because people are more encouraged. They're entering back into the labor force. And of course, as I said, it was about 7% 2014, hitting last December 6.7%. Even when we extend the definition of being unemployed from what's called the U3 measure to the U6 measure, and this U6 measure includes discouraged workers and involuntary part-time jobs, we see that the rates that peaked a little over 20% in 2009 are now below 15%, a similar 5 percentage drop over time. And then if we change from levels in unemployment rates to job growth, year over year, December of 2013 to December 2014, basically the whole year of 2014, employment growth has been 2.8%. In the last 3 months of 2014, we saw the largest job gains for any 3-month period since comparable records have been kept since 1990. So many sectors now are past their pre-recession peaks. Professional business services, education and health services, leisure, hospitality, government are all beyond their previous peaks. Let me just give you a couple of sectors and some really strong growth here. Construction of buildings. You know, we lost over 30% of our construction workers during the recession. That's growing over this past year at 9.3%. Transportation and warehousing is up over 5.5%. Food manufacturing at 5.1%. Full-service restaurants, 4.8%. We're seeing that discretionary spending coming back for households. Construction, overall, all construction, up 3.4%. Manufacturing, all aspects of manufacturing, up 3.4%. Government, up 2.8%. Retail trade, up 2.2%. Even wood products are up 2.3% from the devastating times of the Great Recession. Now, not all sectors have fared as well. Our computer electronics are up only 0.3%. Finance and insurance, of course, they were hit pretty hard, are down 0.5%. Information is down 4%. Now, within that information includes software publishers. They are doing relatively well at a growth of 3.2%. But that drop of 4% is mainly due to newspaper, book, directory publishers. Those are down 7%. You can almost make a correlation between the size of the Oregonian in 2005 and the size today. Now my wife, likes to tape these presentations and play back the sections where I use all these numbers, especially at night when she has trouble sleeping. so I won't keep going on all these numbers. But let me give you some more stats that says the patient is healed. Incomes have been growing stronger in Oregon, with personal income up around 5%. Wages and salaries are up 5.7% over our most recent 4 quarters of data. And jobs do attract people, along, of course, with people's perception of what is livability. So population growth, which was well below 1% annually, is now a bit higher than 1% in our state. So we really have quite a few signs that the patient is much improved and continuing to get better. You know, we dropped into a bad recession, and now we're out of recession. But what I want to do is take a closer look at these numbers. Those are highlighted numbers, and these all look like the patient's healed. But if we peel back and look a little deeper into the weeds, there are different types of measures that may say there could be some ailments still with the patient. You know, it's possible that the hospital that our patient left was a VA hospital, and not everything was healed. I thought that would get more of a reaction than it did. And just want to tell you, that's in the greater context of that issue. I'm not pointing out Oregon here. So I'm really reminded in this instance of a quote from John Maynard Keynes. You know, he said, "Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task. If in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat again." Right, we went through a recession, we're back to where we were, but a lot more has happened during that recession, and a lot more has been going on in the economy that was true before we got into the recession. So, using our patient analogy, the patient may still have some health problems. Let me broadly put these into 2 camps. Problems that were acquired during the recession and not totally healed now, and pre-existing conditions that still persist after the recession is over. We could say that there are cyclical and structural problems that influence our economic well-being. And we can also have structural problems that get worse during recession and improve during the recovery, but still remain as problems. So, cyclical problems are generally remedied by economic recovery. Structural problems remain. Let me start with cyclical problems. These are the health concerns caused by the recession. As I stated, a number of these have returned to health. Our unemployment rate is nowhere near where we want it to be, but it's definitely moving in the right direction and has greatly improved. One problem area, though, associated with unemployment is the duration of unemployment. There's been a slight upward rise in duration of being unemployed since the late 1960s, but this recession pushed this measure to the heights we have never seen. In recession periods since the early 80s, the average duration would peak at around 20 weeks. This recession, it peaked at 40 weeks, double what we've seen at peaks in previous recessions. The average now is down to around 33 weeks, and it's moving in the right direction, but we're out of the recession. Are we expecting economic recovery to further get those duration weeks down? I think it still will, but they still are very stubbornly high. Oregon and most of the other states have a very similar story to exactly this situation of duration of unemployment. We've also seen our labor force participation rate decline in Oregon since around 2000. Similar to the U.S., recently we have seen it rise, and thus the stagnant unemployment rate for much of 2014 that I talked about. Part of this is due to an aging population, but troublesome to this is that we're seeing a decline in the participation rate among the 45 to 54 age group. And that's pretty tough when you lose a job, you're in this age group, your duration of your unemployment becomes longer, you have psychological effects from employers asking if this person is in their 50s, they've been unemployed for over a year. Why is that the case? Is there a problem because they've been unemployed so long? So you also have not only this aspect of being unemployed for a long time, you have this psychological barrier to get a job. The longer you're unemployed, the more skills depreciate over time too. So it is a very nascent problem that we should address. Now, let's turn to job growth. I said it was wonderful, 2.8%. Certain sectors are well above 9%. But what I really want to follow is a blog of Josh Lehner, who's the senior economist in the Office of Economic Analysis, the office I used to direct. And I must say, before I left there, I hired Josh into his position. I also hired Mark McMullen, the now state economist. And it's a little humbling when you realize that you hired people that are doing a better job than you did when you had it. But I relish in the idea, though, that I definitely know how to hire good people. So following Josh Lehner, if we're looking at middle wage jobs, these are like health support, administrative support, people that are in production jobs, sales, teachers, construction workers, installation repair, we see a polarization occurring. This has been accentuated during the recession with job losses in these middle wage jobs hitting teachers and construction workers. These are starting to come back, and the middle wage jobs will start to grow, but their share of total jobs will likely decline as growth in jobs at the lower and upper wage job areas are growing faster. Keep this in mind as we're going to wrap up things as I take a look to the future as to what might be the consequences for our economy of this somewhat shrinking portion of the middle wage jobs. So that's a good segue into looking at incomes. Along these same lines, let's briefly look at middle income households. Median family real income is basically the same today as it was back in 1990. No real improvement in the purchasing power, really, of households. 25 years of no change. But in a Wall Street Journal article looking at what is happening to middle-income families, they report for Oregon that the average income of middle-class families has fallen by 4.6%, while the average income for the top 20% grew 1.1%. And this top quintile represents about 50% of total income in the state, 20% representing about 50%. We have a number of issues here. What are the implications for the middle class falling behind? What does this mean for future consumption, for house buying, education? The continued income inequality, again, what are the implications for our economy? We'll return again to this at the end of my presentation. In the meantime, you should take a look at recently released studies that you'll be hearing about here next Friday, the high cost of low wages in Oregon from the University of Oregon Labor Education Research Center, and then just released also the Stanford University Center on Poverty and Inequality, a State of the States report in 2015. So now let me have another topic, poverty. Oregon is higher than the U.S. average, and I'm just going to leave it at that. Racial disparities among blacks, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic or Latino, relative to other groups, what do we find? Poverty rates are higher, income and wages are lower, education levels are lower, unemployment rates are higher. Those got worse during the recession. They are improved in the recoveries, but the disparities are still existing that were true before we hit the Great Recession. Other factors are at work, and we have to recognize that economic growth alone aren't going to overcome these disparities. Homelessness. Homelessness for Multnomah County is higher in 2012 than it was in 2006. Once again, economic growth helps solve this problem, but it tends not to be enough to solve it completely. Student debt has been going up as a share of household debt since before the Great Recession. It is now the second largest component of household debt behind mortgages. We know that education is linked to higher employment rates. It's linked to higher wages and salaries. It's linked to higher home ownership rates. And what happens if we close out access to higher education because of financial reasons? Now that your glass is more than half empty with those terms, let me take a quick look at the economic future. People always seem to want to hear economic outlooks. And I have a little quote here about economic forecasting that I think is fitting about how people are interested in economic forecasts, even if they're not quite sure they believe them. You know, an economic forecaster is like a cross-eyed javelin thrower. They don't win many accuracy contests, but they keep the crowd's attention. First, strength of our recovery. You know, this recovery now, if we bottomed out in mid-2009, is a little over 5.5 years old. Generally, when we have recoveries, we have fast growth coming out, and then it kind of plateaus. You brought people back in, you're back into close to full employment, things start to slow down. But, you know, so I've told you this 2.8% growth was just last year. Is that an expectation of continuing, or should we slow down? We've already been 5.5 years into recovery. Well, what's unique about following financial crises is that they always take a long time to recover. And you might say that we hit in 2008, where we started to slide down, we bottomed out, we kind of bottom fished for a while, you know, in the first years of recovery. Portland itself starting to move up a little bit, but very, very slow. And in many respects, we are in the first stages of robust recovery. So even though it's been 5.5 years, we sort of put off the first 4 years almost of not doing much of anything, really trying to gain confidence back into our financial sector and our economy. And so really, I think we can have strong growth again coming into 2015 and maybe even 2016, because in essence, we're in the early stages of a classic recovery right now. We've had oil prices decline. This is especially helpful for low-income families. Low-income families tend to spend a higher proportion of their incomes on energy-related items. Having this drop in the gas pump price is very helpful for their budgets, and that's a good sign for us economically. Do we have any game changers because of what happened in the recession? Well, home ownership rates fell during the recession. They're back to about 1990 levels. Are they going to be going back up? Will the cost of education be a barrier to access for individuals? Businesses, they're going to face in Oregon and elsewhere many proposals to raise minimum wages. This really is a consequence of the increasing economic inequality and what we feel we may need to do something about it. Now, what will be the impact in the economies if we raise minimum wages? And of course, it means who is covered, what is the amount of minimum wage, all that will matter. Well, it really comes down to, you know, is my economist stronger than your economist? You know, raising minimum wages will have minimal impacts on jobs, anywhere to that they will have larger impacts and they will lower the number of jobs. My personal feeling on this is that I don't think it'll have a large impact on jobs. When you're really talking about the numbers out here of who is covered by the minimum wage, overall, you're not having a big, huge influence. So, but as I said, someone else may have a stronger economist than me. And then lastly, I want to mention something about climate change. And this is more of a long-range aspect. You know, it was here before the recession. It's still here after the recession. There are many economic costs associated with climate change. You know, costs due to health, to storms, to droughts that need to be addressed. Climate change is not a liberal concern for environment versus a conservative concern for jobs. And I would say we need to take the example that we found of environmental groups in forest industry finding common grounds concerning the health of Eastern Oregon forests. I suggest that listeners of today's program take a look at a website called republicen.org. This is a group of political conservatives concerned about climate change. And we have to realize if we're going to help out our economy and help us out in other ways, we do have common ground on this issue. And the common ground is that we simply live on the same planet. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and I also want to thank the City Club for inviting me to be here and for holding this today. Tom, I'd like to start with talking about the role of public policy and public spending. For a long time, you've noted that we don't have two economies, a public sector and private sector. It's one economy, and you and I often paraphrase this in talks, you in this room said, you know, think of the dry cleaner in Pendleton. That person doesn't have two cash registers, one for those working at the prison and one for everyone else. Talk for a bit about how did federal and state public policy and public spending help get us out of the recession, and what should state and federal policymakers have done to ensure a more equitable recovery, more equitable rewards of our increased productivity, of our increased economic activity?
All right, I'm glad I ended my comments early, given this question. This is a long, long question, and I don't know if I'm going to sufficiently answer it. Let me try the first part about public policy and how maybe it assisted during this recession. You know, we were really facing the likes of another Great Depression in our country, and also here in Oregon. And you want to keep in mind that state governments have to balance their budgets. So when you have a decline in economic activity, and especially when you have a tax base like income, which is so important for Oregon's tax base, go down dramatically, your tax revenues go down dramatically. Your ability to spend more to help out in terms of public policy is constrained at the state level. You have to balance your budget. So it really was up to the federal government. And the one thing I didn't like about the federal government aspect, their bailout, I really thought they should have had a more concerted package in providing states with funding. They did through the American Recovery and Relief Program that was on, where we fixed up bridges and we fixed up all sorts of things that were out there, water supplies, you name it, that were projects around the state throughout the country. But they really could have helped the states out more out of this dilemma of what they were facing when they have to drop their spending quite dramatically. It was sort of like just keeping them standing still by being able to provide these other programs. But as I said, this was a Great Depression situation. We had to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this thing to try to survive. And I think it was the appropriate policies to do, and I do believe it helped. When we take a look at other countries, other situations where they have gone through financial crises, those periods before they get back to, say, the same level of employment they did before the financial crisis, we're usually talking about 15, 20 years to come back. Here, we're talking about 6+ years to come back. That, in relative sense, is a short time period following a major financial crisis. And I think it was our public policies and our spendings that help us get out of it. Now, are there unintended consequences of doing these public policies? If we take a look at the Federal Reserve policy, for example, we have an amazing amount of money that's sitting out there that could be put to work almost instantly and could cause inflation, if you believe that, in our economy. But hey, I'd rather have these unintended consequences than have faced the situation of digging out of a Great Depression rather than digging out of a Great Recession. So I think they really were helpful. Now, the second part of your question is much harder. What could they do to sort of make this more equitable, spread, in a sense, the wealth around? You know, we like to think that, you know, when you have the economic seas rise, right, all ships equally rise with it. And, of course, we have not. I've given you some examples where we've seen, you know, the job growth, for example, has been tended at the lower wage and the higher wage area and not very much in the middle wage area. You know, what could we have done to do something different on that? And there, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that, you know, public policy has a place, but public policy is not, I don't think, as strong to be able to change these streams that we've seen in our economy. There are certain structural aspects, changes that are part of our makeup of how our economy operates, and public policy has an ability to do something about it, but I don't know if they are strong enough to actually change this completely. Now, does this mean that, is it the offshoring of jobs and we've lost manufacturing? Manufacturing jobs have gone down over time. Those are a lot of the middle income wage jobs that we would have had. Was there some way to stem that or not? You know, you have these world dynamics here where you almost wonder whether a company that would not have been allowed to go overseas, if they would have stayed here, would they have gone under? That's a very tricky thing to actually try to measure. So, as I said, you know, public policy has a place. I think it has a place for longer range also aspects, setting a nice environment for having economic growth and having equality. And it can do some things in the short run. but it also has limitations.
Okay. Economists can disagree on a lot of things, but there's one probably economic truth that I think most economists would agree on, which is that business cycles happen. There's sort of an economist bumper sticker, that might be it. And that neither Congress nor the Oregon legislature can repeal the business cycle. It's going to happen. So today we're in a recovery period, but there will be a downturn. We don't know when it's going to be, and more often than not, as you've noted in the past, you don't know when you're in a recession until you're well into it. And that's happened with this last recession. So do you think Oregon's prepared for the next downturn? And back to public policy, what policies ought to be enacted or pursued to better prepare for the downturn?
You know, it was always kind of tough when I was state economist, and whenever you would say something like, you know, conditions are such, and I think we're headed for a recession. And then newspapers would come out, and they would say it this way: Tom Potowski calls for a recession. You know, it's not, I didn't call for one, it's just that it looked like one was going to happen. I'm not that powerful in the job. You know, so here we are. We were unprepared for a lot of recessions in the past in Oregon. And a lot of it is a sort of a double whammy against us. It's a double whammy helpful, and it's a double whammy bad for us. When things are growing fast, jobs are going up, our tax structure causes us to gain revenues quite quickly. And what would happen, though, is that rather than those revenues growing and growing and growing, and maybe we could put those into a rainy day fund, we have something called a kicker in Oregon. And it was based on the forecast from my office that would be made more than 2 years before the actual numbers came in after the biennial budgeting period. And if the actual revenues, more than 2 years into the future, came in 2% or higher than that forecast, everything above the forecast was refunded to personal income tax payers. And there was also a corporate kicker at that time. So here you are. Given the type of nature of the economy, it's mostly manufacturing based. We make things here in Oregon. Durable manufacturing, that tends to be the most volatile sector through the business cycle. We have a tax structure that tends to be one of the most volatile tax structures through the business cycle. So when things go down, we lose lots of jobs, we lose lots of tax revenues. When things are good, we get jobs faster than the U.S. generally growing, like we are right now, growing faster than the U.S., and we get revenues coming in greater. But that old kicker, you know, grabs those and doesn't allow it to go in a rainy day fund. So what have we done to try to maybe remedy this? Because this is what we should do. We're trying to smooth out, right? You know, what we should do is try to say, okay, during the good times, we put money away because we know there's going to be a recession. And when it goes down, can we have some reserves that we can fill that hole? The city of Portland has had good reserves for quite a while, but the state has been lacking in it. Well, legislators finally decided to change that in 2005 and 2007 again. The corporate kicker now is dedicated to the school safety fund. And hopefully there'll be some legislation at some day to change the kicker around.
I was waiting for you to get to that. So if you were in the legislature today, would you have as a high priority improve the rainy day fund? And that may be one of the ways to do it?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have and we're starting to build up a more decent rainy day fund, both one for the general fund and one for basically K through 12. But they need to be stronger and they need to be set in place. But the other thing I wanted to say is that, sorry, I had a senior moment. Go ahead.
I can relate to that sometimes. So, you know, a number of labor economists will say that, yeah, we have these structural problems in our economy, but if you look at what's been happening in recovery periods since the 40s, that it used to be we had shared prosperity, that as the economy grew, all the income quintiles, the fifths, all grew as well. But starting after the late 70s, that didn't happen. It all goes to, disproportionate share goes to the top 1%. The Occupy movement put that into our lexicon. But a labor economist will say, well, we have to get back to full employment. And full employment doesn't mean zero unemployment. It means very low. We were low in the late 90s, and we had across the income scale people seeing gains. It was also when we had the 5 out of the last 42 or 41 years when our unemployment was below the national average. So let's talk about how do you get to full employment, which that we've had in the 90s, actually into 2000, it was the national unemployment rate was below 5%. So do we do programs like state public funding of retrofitting buildings for good jobs and saving energy? Do we do work share programs so that, expand our work share program so that when there's an employer's laying off people, they don't have to, they can do it, they can bring them back part-time to keep more people? Should we do paid sick days, family leave, or maybe even if radical paid vacation so that we can be more like Europe where people work 20% less hours in a week, which creates more jobs for everybody else when you have that. So what should we do to get to full employment?
Well, of course, a true economist would say, well, you sit back and just let it go. And the other thing I would point out is Europe isn't quite at full employment, even with all these policies. And we got to full employment here in Oregon and in the country in 2005, but how did we get there? We got there on speculation, on overbuilding of housing. We got there on an unsustainable platform. So what we should do, and maybe Chuck, if I would change your question around a little bit, is how do you get to a sustainable full employment level? One that we know isn't built on, a stack of cards of these mortgage-backed securities that we saw before the financial crisis. So by the way, we're going in that direction. I don't see a bubble that's out there. So I think you kind of, when you have recessions, you sort of have a reset button. You get everything more in line with one another. And I think you can then start to grow and have a more sustainable case. We did a lot of these programs in order to help out people to get jobs and so forth. My concern is at what point, is it true that the economy can work on its own and doesn't need these type of policies, and we have the price system do its magic in allocating resources efficiently among their uses? Or do we interfere with that still and have policies where we want to have more money spent into retrofitting into energy is because possibly the market isn't providing us with those signals? So those are really tough questions to try to get at. What I would say is that we definitely want to get to full employment. We want to get there sustainably. I also want the market and price systems to work the way they're supposed to work. And so the question here is our system the way it works today? We've got these jumper cables on the economic engine. We're giving it juice and it's operating. I would like to be able to take those jumper cables off and still see that engine operating smoothly. But I don't know if that's possible. So do we still need to have this mix? I still believe, for example, the market system is a human-made system. It wasn't given us by God, and it has flaws to it. If we set it up, set the rules of the game of how a market system works, and provide that incentives out there, I think we can get to full employment without an increase in public policies.
But, back to the hospital analogy, if statistics came out that poor people are leaving the hospital not as well as wealthy people, as the top 1%, I think there'd be outrage and people would be looking into what should the hospital do differently, right? And it seems to me that our unequal recovery and growing income inequality show that the private market economy has failures. It needs controls. That this idea that you can have a free market and just let it happen doesn't work. The fact that we had income growth and that recoveries prior to 1979 were more shared shows that we can be optimistic that we can get back to that. But it's not providing good wages for a good day's work. It's not providing incomes that lift people out of poverty, and it's not giving any semblance of shared prosperity from the economic growth. So what could we do so to more efficiently implement, deal with the market failures? It seems raising the minimum wage, I don't think we should debate how high it should go, but it seems like that's one no-brainer. Isn't that like the easiest way, knowing that a lot of poor people work, to lift people out of poverty, you raise the minimum wage?
Well, I agree if we believe that the income inequality is what we might call a market failure. And I have to be honest, many economists see income distribution as the residual. The economy works, and if it's working efficiently, da-da-da-da-da, whatever is the income distribution that happens after that must be the right one. Now, I'm not in that camp, and I don't buy that. So we really need to investigate, as like in Piketty's book, Capital, why have we seen this inequality happening? And really, as you said, Chuck, sort of the beginning of the 1970s was sort of this Bermuda Triangle of economic data. Everything started to go haywire at this period. And we started to see, as we went forward, if we call it labor and capital, capital getting a larger share of the total output than what labor was getting. Now, how do we policy change that around and do it in a way that still keeps economic incentives in the economy? One aspect is, just as Chuck said, is raising the minimum wage. It appears that the number of people that are under that level of minimum wage are not a huge number of people, and raising it, in my mind, would not cause a great disruption, and it probably would be helpful in trying to change this income inequality. But that's just one little aspect. There still is a lot of income inequality out there. What particular public policy can we do that, as I said, we always have a problem in the economy between two main E's, efficiency and equity. And many times when we try to be more efficient, we may lose on the equity side, and vice versa. And somewhere there's a sweet spot. I don't know what that is or what policy would provide us that.
Well, I mean, I look at the infrastructure needs in this country and state, and I say, invest in that, and that produces good jobs, and that it's important for our business climate and quality of life. And so I think there's things we can do in public investments that would get us to full employment, and at full employment, we get the result out of economic growth that we want. That's proven in the 90s, was proven prior to the 70s. So I want to know if you think, are we in a shared economy or a share of the scraps economy, as Robert Reich says? He points to on-demand work, like software jobs where you get a job to do a particular thing at a particular moment. There's this marketplace on Amazon you can sign up for and do these little jobs. And he says, in his view, it's a culmination of a process where corporate America went to temporary workers, or as they call them in Canada, precarious workers, and more independent contractors and consultants, and that it shifts risks and uncertainties onto workers, like piece, it's sort of like the piecework of the 19th century, is how he puts it. So a two-part question. Is that where we're headed in vehicles, in the Uber fleet? And some economists praise on-demand work as being efficient. And you said, efficiency is one of the issues. But Reich says, and I quote, "The biggest economic challenge we face isn't using people more efficiently, it's allocating work and the gains from work more decently." Could you talk about that?
All right, so we are in a situation where this is, I think, exactly as you're describing it. We're having people, their real incomes are not rising. They're just running in place as best they can. And we're getting this greater income inequality. And one aspect that I see is trying to get out of this, and we're running in the opposite direction there, is really the cost of higher education. This is, we have all sorts of inputs that go into a production process, and there's the human input. And if we start to have that those that have the economic means can go to higher education, then those inputs will have the skills to be able to continue on, and we'll have a greater proportion of people that don't have those skills, don't have the economic well-being that we'd like them to do.
Thank you. I think it's time for members' questions.
It is, thank you. And now if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. And we will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, identify yourself as a City Club member. Please ask only one question and ask your question as succinctly as possible. If I flash this question mark card, it means please wrap up your question.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. Tom, given what you just said about higher education and what you said earlier about student debt, to the extent that here in Oregon, public universities have replaced their diminished direct government support with student debt rather than with private sector fundraising, exacerbating this problem and creating this bubble where people can't afford houses because of their loan commitment. What can we do to change that and to keep places like UO, OSU, and PSU from really buying into that system?
Okay, this is really tough. And Oregon is not alone on this. All the states that have faced a budget problem, they've all looked to whatever government agency or organization that is at the state, and they go, anyone that can raise your own fees, raise your own funds, you go ahead and do that, and that'll allow us then to fund the other things that don't have that capability. And so tuitions and fees at public universities have risen dramatically over time. So, what can we do about this if now, we're having, a student that has student debt, they get out, given now if they're going to buy a home, it's come full circle. If you're going to get a mortgage, they actually are demanding that you have a source of income these days, which wasn't necessary before. And if you have debt already, it's going to be very tough to meet that credit threshold to be able to get a mortgage. So you also have a problem, really, in demand for the housing market, too. And so, is Obama's idea of trying to have open, free access to community colleges is one way of possibly getting to this? And how is it paid for? So I think what it comes down to really is we have to reset our priorities. We know we only have so much funding, and we got to realize that there are trade-offs. And so if we're going to provide more funding scholarship-wise for students to get into higher ed, we're going to have to bite the bullet and realize something else may get less.
Or raise taxes. Or raise taxes.
Or we can raise taxes.
Ted Kay, City Club member. The Oregonian recently published a chart that showed that as a person earning minimum wage earns more, the government subsidies tend to decline nearly equally. So when the hourly minimum wage goes from $9 to $15, $6 in benefits get phased out. That seems to imply that increasing the minimum wage is a transfer of the responsibility of that support, that $6, from government to employers. So the question, should the government subsidize an increase in the minimum wage by employers?
And this was a question for Chuck, right?
Yeah. Well, the government does. So first I'll say that the number is a bad number, and there's a post on our webpage about it, why it's bad. It was a crazy hypothetical example used by Legislative Revenue Office economists that has no sort of basis in reality of minimum wage workers. That said, the government subsidizes, and it's going to be a topic of next week's Friday Forum, the government subsidizes the private market all the time. It's with our earned income tax credit, with our food stamp program, with other subsidy programs. The issue in the minimum wage, there's a very small child care subsidy program called Employment Related Daycare, ERDC as it's known by the wonks. And it only serves 9,000 families in Oregon. And there's a waiting list for it, and the waiting list isn't always open to even get on it, so it's not a true waiting list of need. And it's never been a big program. It used to not have a waiting list. It was sort of just the best kept secret. And the program says as your income goes up, you have to pay a little more of a copay towards the child care you're getting, the subsidy you're getting. And it says right in their manual, the copay should not undermine your wage or earnings increase. But their rules don't follow that at a couple income levels. And at a couple income levels, your copay goes up more than the extra hours or extra pay you got. And so that's what needs to get fixed in that situation. But we subsidize all the time. In the ideal world, we'd be paying enough. We wouldn't have a food stamp program for people who work. We wouldn't have housing subsidies for people who work. We wouldn't have an earned income tax credit that you'd be able to get by on what you're getting paid. But the market has failures, and the government subsidizes it. And in a lot of states, when there's been, over the last 10, 15 years, when there's debates about the minimum wage, often the restaurant industry comes in and says, oh no, just do a state earned income tax credit. Pass it on to the employers. Pass it on to the taxpayers. Don't make us pay for it. So, I think that we need to raise the floor, which will help save money in some of the subsidy programs. And I can guarantee you an increase in the minimum wage helps every person that's getting the increase fully. And so this idea that it's bad because you'd only have that $49 headline was really misplaced and sort of indicative of the Oregonian these days.
But the one thing I would add is that we do need to think about what policies, what government programs are there that could possibly be affected because you've gone into a higher income level, and there needs to be a coordination of that.
That's right, and the one program that affects people who are working and have kids is this very small child care subsidy program. It's not what people think of as welfare, temporary assistance to needy families, because it has very few people working and getting TANF, because if you work 2 days a week, you're too rich to get temporary assistance to needy families if you're a single parent with 2 children. It's the income level to get into that program was frozen in July of 1991. Okay, and it's lost out to inflation and minimum wage increases ever since. So that's not the program. The food stamp program has a glide path down as your income goes up, and we can't change those. It's really this one small, very small child care subsidy program whose rules don't follow its intent, and the legislature's looking at it. I'm testifying this afternoon on that matter.
Win Wakala, City Club member. I remember a study that showed that the wages of CEOs went from maybe 5 times as much as the regular employees to up to 100 times as much now. Is there some way to deal with this greed at the upper level?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's greed or lack of empathy, as Nicholas Kristof wrote a week or so ago about his friend that he grew up with in Yamhill County. I think there's one proposal that I think may have been introduced is to not let companies expense for tax purposes have to add back in excessive salaries. So they can pay the CEO the multi-million-dollar salary, but any amount over a certain amount is not a deductible expense for tax purposes. So there are incentives to do that. I think, there's been some stuff on shareholder rights and whatnot to try to get companies, and there's laws to get companies to do a better job of setting them. But I don't really know how you get it. I once saw the movie many years ago, Seven Deadly Sins. I don't know how you deal with the greed issue.
Yeah, and especially in the financial sector, there's almost a call out to really question. In the financial area, the CEOs that were making these huge salaries, and then they take a look and they go, well, what did we get for this? And so, just as Chuck was saying, there's many proposals out there. Even the companies themselves are introspectively looking at what they're paying their CEOs.
Elsa Porter, City Club member. As I recall, Thomas Piketty recommended that the cure for the ills of capitalism in the 21st century was a wealth tax. I would like to know what your views are about a wealth tax in Oregon.
So out there, and there are some people who've been talking about one. No, only one state did. I don't know if they still do tax intangibles. Wealth taxes. The problem with a wealth tax is they really blow it on the efficiency and complexity issue on both of those. They're very hard to enforce. Our income tax system, which is a voluntary system essentially, works at the state level because we have this federal system and all the reporting that happens under that. You don't have that for a wealth tax. And just imagine if I have to, all the small businesses from the coffee carts here in Portland to small coffee shops to dry cleaners or whatever, having to pay people to come up with what's the value of your business and your wealth that you have that you own as a proprietor. I just think it's not possible. Can we tax wealth? Absolutely. And can we tax stuff that's related to the accumulation of wealth? Absolutely. I think the president, I thought it was the stepped up basis, the inheritance thing that the president suggested, that's huge. It's a huge cost. How to do that right and politically get it through, I don't know. But there's ways to do that. There's also people looking at transactions, a small transaction tax on the national level to try to capture some of that. But wealth is on a state level would be very hard to tax.
Paul Anthony, City Club member. Professor Potowski, you've declared the patient healed. You've given us a long-term prognosis. I want to ask about activities of daily living. As young people are looking 30 or 40 years into the future, what sectors do you think have some long-term potential? And particularly, what skills do you think are going to be valued over the long term?
Well, no one will remember in 30 years from now, so. And I think, one of the, or my other response was going to be Canada, I think would be a good place to go. But no, really. One of the toughest things when we talk about 30 years from now is, the toughest thing in a crystal ball is what's going to be the next technological change that's going to occur, where that'll be the skills that's needed into the future. And I don't think it's, remotely flying drones, is the skill that's going to be the one in highest demand. But it is going to be, and this may seem trite, when we keep talking about knowledge-based economy, and it's some aspect of knowledge base that we should know. But really, it's, at least for our country here, we're always on the edge of technology and needing technological breakthroughs. Most of the inventions and so on tend to still start in the U.S. And then as they become more like commodities, they've moved overseas where labor costs are lower. So to stay on this sort of edge, I think, of having higher incomes, having job capabilities and so on, I don't know what the next technological change is going to be, but I want people to have the skills that are going to figure out what that next technological change is. So really, the knowledge base, education, those, I think, are the areas that I think people should try to go into.
And I just want to say that related to that, I think it's spot on, it is, we have technological change, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're losing jobs. In Detroit and elsewhere, they now they have robots putting windshields in new cars, right? But if you break your windshield, a robot's not going to be able to come to your house with the skills to take out your old one and put in a new one, right? And so with drones are going to need people to program them and fix them and other things. And so, I don't even know what the jobs are related to drones. So the technological change doesn't necessarily mean you're losing jobs. Let's make sure we're training people, and those are jobs and things that can't get exported outside. Certain services cannot get exported to other countries.
So we have time for one more question.
Dave Porter, City Club member. What do you think the importance and future is of international trade for Oregon?
So, I think we're very well positioned. Our largest trading partner right now is Canada, although China came from nowhere 15 years ago to just before the recession to being our #1 trading partner. So I think we're very well positioned in the Pacific Rim. We have cultural ties overseas, both through like the city of Portland, through Portland State, through University of Oregon, many other social arrangements that are occurring in the state. So I think both with the cultural aspect, with the businesses that we have, Nike, Intel, so on as examples, we have very good close ties, I think, overseas. So I think going forward, international trade is going to be a major factor for our economy.
We have run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. As we close, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to Friday Forum Committee member Bill Holmer, who produced today's event, and our panelists, Dr. Tom Potowski and Chuck Sheketoff. Thank you.